concern you, because if you've had a heart attack, whether you have symptoms or not, you're 2 to 3 times more likely to die in the next 12 months. So it's very important to know these things. Now, the Guard Heart mantra is learn, detect, and prevent. And I'm going to tell you this, what you heard earlier today, where you may know more than the doctors that you're seeing, unfortunately is oftentimes true. And especially with glutathione products and heart disease, because people tend to follow guidelines, and the guidelines are about 15 years behind the times. So what we find is the Guard Heart folks spend a lot of time not just educating the public, but also physicians. And we have a separate group called SOFI, which stands for Wisdom, that actually does that. Now, detect means that a lot of the tools that we're using today just aren't sufficiently sensitive. And prevention we're going to go into. So we're going to cover these things fairly quickly. So the burden of heart disease in 50 years has not really changed. As a matter of fact, in 2015, the rate of heart disease accelerated again after going down for a period of time. It means that within the next 20 years, 40% of the population is going to have heart disease. That's a huge number. And it doesn't matter where you came from, what socioeconomic status you are. Everybody is at risk. And the most difficult part of this is that most people have no symptoms before they have a heart attack. In fact, the majority of them. And over half the people that have a heart attack have normal cholesterol levels, and I guarantee you that your doctors are primarily focused on that. And so in women, it's even particularly worse, because I think that there was a study that showed that 50% of women did not know that heart disease is the #1 killer of women. And you're 5 times more likely to die of heart disease than you are breast cancer. And 2/3 of women have no symptoms before a heart attack occurs, more than men. So it's very important that you take this seriously. And I've had people say to me, "That's okay, I don't want to know, I'd rather have the heart attack and get it over." But I'm sorry, you know what? Out of 19 people that have a heart attack today, 18 are going to survive. But within 2 years, half those people are going to be permanently disabled. You're going to cost your family and relatives money, and the average cost of surviving a heart attack now runs about $1 million, okay? So it's much better to prevent it. And the other thing I tell people is that in the United States, 67% of all bankruptcies are due to healthcare issues. It's not right. So what can we do about that? Well, most people think that you see people with these symptoms, they get chest pain. This is an example of what looks like a pimple on the side of an artery. And what happens is it pops. But before it pops, it doesn't give you any warning. And what that's caused by is free radical damage. Have you all heard of free radicals before? And you know, one of the reasons why I recommend Max products is because the master antioxidant in your body is glutathione. And what does that mean? From a prevention standpoint, it means your body is always being exposed to free radicals. If you are stressed, if you eat too much sugar, you drink too much alcohol, you exercise too much, you're generating free radicals. But if you have adequate glutathione levels, you can neutralize those free radicals and give yourself a better chance. It's just like playing soccer. The more shots on goal, the more likely you are to get a goal. And that's not a good thing when you're talking about your arteries. So keep that in mind. Now, the pulse cardiac test was developed to address this big black hole in our evaluation of people's risk. Because what the pulse cardiac test is doing, it's measuring the first injury to the biggest organ in your body. Does anybody know what the biggest organ in your body is?
Your skin.
Skin is a good guess. It's actually the endothelium. It's the skin of your arteries, okay? So it's the lining of your arteries. And you know that organ has a sophisticated signaling system because it's under high pressure. And if it gets damaged and you start leaking blood in the tissue is not a good thing. It's very inflammatory. And so what happens is your body sends out, the the damaged lining to your coronary artery sends out a signal to your body that I need to get fixed, and I need to get fixed now. And what we found is we could detect those signals, so it's much earlier than any cholesterol signal or anything like that. And that's what we use. There's 9 proteins that we use. It's a simple blood test, and what it does is it allows us to detect early damage and what stage you're in and if it's progressing. And then we use that same information to predict your risk of having a heart attack in a 5-year period. It's not real complicated. The science behind it is, and they told me I can't talk about that today because they don't want people's eyes to glaze over and they want it to stay awake. So I'm not going to do that. But I will tell you that what you get is a score. And that score is actually the number of people with your age and sex that had a heart attack in a 5-year period. And we also know what your target score is. And so we give you something to work towards, and at the end of this I'm going to show you 4 cases, one of whom you know, and show you how you can do something about this. Then we also give you heart age. Now heart age is probably the most troubling to people because it turns out that 2/3 of the population of the United States has a heart age that's significantly older than their chronologic age. And it's a function of our lifestyle, the stress. And then we also give you some specific recommendations, so that's how we get there. Now I'm going to go into some things, prevention, okay? There's 5 pillars, and we're on the first one here with Max, nutrition and diet, and I consider supplements part of the nutrition picture. Physical activity, probably one of the biggest deficits in every population in the world is that people have become more sedentary. They do video games, they text people, they don't go out and walk and visit. And smoking, surprisingly, smoking is still very prominent in various parts of the world. 60% of Asian men smoke. And number 4 is probably the most difficult for modern people. It's stress, okay? And it's another reason why I think Max products are so critical, because you can't always manage your stress. You can do meditation, you can try and do mindfulness, but it's not always possible for you to quit a stressful job. And so that's the most difficult one that we have. And then, while I use a lot of nutritional supplements, I also use allopathic medication, and one of the biggest problems we have is people not taking their medications. And so you have to really do that. Compliance, there's a 50-50-50 study that showed that 50% of the people that get a prescription don't fill it. 50% of the people that do fill a prescription don't take it, even though they got it. And then 50% of those that start it quit within 6 months. So, if that's the case, you really need to let your healthcare practitioner know. Now, one of the other problems we have is that we don't, and this is why the pulse test is so important, because sometimes we measure the wrong thing. Now, right now, one of our biggest measures of health is BMI, body mass index, okay? And, I'm the same weight I was in high school, but I guarantee you that I would be probably slightly towards the overweight section because I've lost muscle mass, and yet I'm not. If you look at my body fat composition, it's fairly low. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. I've got 2 ladies, both the same weight. One of them has a body fat composition of around 38%, the other is 18%. And why is that? Well, it's because muscle weighs more than fat, and muscle allows you to store excess carbohydrates and sugar and energy that comes into your body. So one of the things that we're trying to move towards with the Garda Heart Foundation is not simply using BMI, but also using your muscle and fat composition, because that'll give you a better idea of what you need to do, okay? And just some examples of what healthy fat compositions are. Men typically should be a little bit less than women, and if you're in the 23% or higher, that's unhealthy for men. 32% for women. So, and I do want to stress that it is not a good thing to body shame people, because there are physiological differences in people that contribute to their weight gain. Sometimes it's a thyroid problem. Most commonly, it's that you're not sensitive enough to insulin. And surprisingly, the biggest culprit in that is your diet and lack of exercise. And why that's important is because there's hope. So I'm just going to talk briefly about healthy weight loss, because if you look at the commercially available weight loss programs, and I'm not talking about the Max Switch program, I'm talking about the Jenny Craig's, etc. The majority of weight loss is muscle. Yes. It's muscle. It's terrible. And you really want to lose fat. And so this is probably a little bit more radical for some of you, but it is not calories in and calories out. Calories are important, but the calories are not all created equal. There was a little lady up in Los Angeles who maybe 60 years ago did a study on food, and they used something called a bomb calorimeter. They put the food in there, they exploded, and they checked to see how much extra energy came out of it. And, so as an example, 100 calories worth of protein gives you 100 calories when you put it in a bomb calorimeter. And 100 grams of carbohydrates gives you the same thing. But when you put it in your body, the 100 grams of protein only gives you, the 100 calories of protein only gives you 75 calories because you burn 25 to digest it. Whereas the carbohydrates, the sugar, you get the full benefit of all of those calories. And that's why we say you start focusing on your sugar and carbohydrate intake and make sure you eat healthy protein. Calories are still important, but how you burn that fuel is important too. And if you look at this slide, I'm going to see if I got this. This is cool. Okay, this is insulin. And when you're younger, your body is very sensitive to insulin. But as you age, typically around the age of 40, your body starts becoming less sensitive to insulin. So if you continue to eat the way you did when you were younger, you're going to put on weight because you cannot do that. You need to change your diet at that point, cut back on the carbs and the refined sugar. And there's this phenomenon of spillover, which has not been widely appreciated, but this is related to muscle mass, okay? The reason that older people have such difficulty is because they don't have as much muscle mass. You lose muscle mass as you age. And it turns out that when you're younger, you eat those extra calories and you have insulin and you store that in your muscle. When you lose muscle as you get older, you're not able to store it as much, and there's this phenomenon called spillover. What that means is it doesn't get into the muscle, so where does it go? It goes to your liver and gets converted to fat and triglycerides. And that's the cycle that we need to break, and that's why the Switch program is a good program for that. So now there's one other concept that I got to get for you, and it's called metabolics. So in other words, it's really what we're trying to do is to alter your metabolism. So the things that impact you negatively are no exercise, poor diet, poor supplements. There are so many supplements on the market that are just not worth taking. And that's why it's very important to be very careful what you put in your body. Some of them are actually toxic. There's a significant amount of heavy metal contamination for some of the ones that have come into our country. Stress and alcohol are there. And what they all do is they cause metabolic damage. And so the goal of exercise is not just to burn calories. That's the old concept. The goal of exercise is to optimally make your metabolism the way it should be. Some people will need a little more cardio, some people will need a little more resistance training, but the bottom line is you have to master both of those to be effective. Too much of one is not good. And what that allows us to do is to fine-tune your body no matter what age you are. So that's kind of the background. The pulse test helps us figure out where you are. Now I'm just going to talk briefly about some things because these are probably the most common questions I get. And then I'm going to go through some real-life case studies. So people ask, what are healthy fats? Okay? Well, I can guarantee you that if you are getting olive oil, peanut oil, avocado oil, or grapeseed oil in particular is one that I'm fond of, those actually stimulate your body to burn calories the right way. And they're also equivalent to a statin in primary prevention. People didn't know that, but the American Heart Association finally came out and indicated that. So what that means is 2 tablespoons of olive oil in the morning is as good as taking a statin if you've never had a heart attack. Now, if you're doing both, I don't want you to stop your statins, because there's evidence that if you're on statins and you stop, your risk of having a heart attack goes up. So once you're on them, you should probably stick with it. The other thing is that polyunsaturated fats, and I'm talking about the high omega-3s, are extremely good for you. And the reason that's important is because there are all kinds of omegas, and omega just refers to the point in the chain of the fatty acid where the unsaturated point is located. And as you know, I'm very fond of wild-caught fish. I am totally against farm fish until things change. And the other thing is that for those vegans out there, the form of omega-3s in flaxseed and chia seeds is the wrong kind for your body. It doesn't have the same effect in your body. It's LNA or ALA. And your body has to convert it, and unfortunately, your body's not very good at doing that. If you're really good, you may convert 15% of that, so you're not getting an adequate dose. So, in my opinion, and I often tell this to my vegan and vegetarian friends, you need to become a pescatarian and at least use fish oil. And the other thing is that in the United States, if I were to go to Japan, the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is around 1. They eat a lot of fish and they have a lower rate of heart disease and stroke. If I come to the United States, the average is 16, which is not good. That means we get too much omega-6 in our diet. We're swimming in omega-6s. And then if I go to the deep south, it's 30, okay? These are not good numbers, and they're definitely associated with a higher risk. So keep that in mind. Now let's talk about carbohydrates and sugar, and then I'm going to go through some cases, and I'm going to bring up a testimonial. So what is it about carbohydrates and sugar? I already covered this. I told you your body treats those as 100% sugar, okay? But what else do they do? They create free radicals, and it's well documented. And they also screw up your sensitivity to insulin, which is critical. Now, the other thing that you've heard me talk about is fat-free diet and low-fat diets. Not good for you. Why is that? They're loaded with sugar. In fact, a study came out last week that showed it was comparing saturated fat in your diet to a low-fat diet. And do you know what they found? And this is 135,000 people. People who ate saturated fat were 2 to 3 times less likely to have heart disease, death, or strokes than people who ate a high carbohydrate diet. It doesn't get any more clear than that. You really need to focus on, you know, the European Medical Society has come out and said there's no evidence that saturated fat in your diet causes heart disease. Trans fat, absolutely. Trans fats, artificially modified fats. So, my caution to you at this point is stay away from fat-free foods. Eat full-fat food in moderation. Saturated fat is okay in moderation. It's still calorie dense. And the other key part of this is that the fats in your diet help you absorb key vitamins like A, D, E, and K, which are absolutely critical for your health. And this is the one that's, I think it depends on where you're from. I love kimchi. Kimchi is just absolutely wonderful in my book. And sauerkraut. Now, it turns out that they're extremely good probiotics. They're 20 times more powerful than yogurt, okay? But they're all good for you. And the reason they're good for you, and that's why I like the probiotics and some of the Max products, is because your gut affects the way you process your food and vitamins. So, for instance, if you take antibiotics and you knock out the bacteria in your gut, and what grows back isn't the right bacteria, those bacteria can contribute to toxins entering your body. And the reason that I suggest that probiotics are so important for you is because you need to keep that balanced, because it will maintain your health and it'll prevent toxic compounds from being produced in your body. And now, this is my final slide before I get to the case studies. And I've covered a lot of this, but I do want you to know that there is a place in your prevention program for supplements. And Max products are on my list: niacins, omega-3s, aged garlic, which has been shown in clinical studies to work. And I do think there's a place for vitamins depending on where you are. It has to be in moderation. Infuse is a great product. But in concert with that, probably the most important thing that I can tell you is that you need to move, okay? You just need to move your body. And it doesn't take much, and I'm going to show you a case and the prescription that I do for it in a minute, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. So where the Garda Heart folks want to go is they don't want you to be in a position where they don't know what's going on. They want you to know your risk, and they want to empower you to change it, and that's the goal of what we're talking to you about today. So now I get to show you the fun stuff, because you're going to recognize some of these people, okay? So these are examples of how the pulse test fits into your program. It doesn't replace anything your doctor's doing. This first case is a 78-year-old gentleman, and he was part of our clinical trial a year earlier. If you look down here, his pulse score at that time was only 3.6%, and that's normal for a 77-year-old. His daughter brought him in 12 months later because she said he wasn't feeling right. About a month earlier, he just seemed to lose his energy, and he said, I'm just getting old. And the only thing that happened during that year that was different was his wife had been in and out of the hospital and almost died 2 or 3 times, and he was the primary caregiver, so he had a lot of stress. He was part of an HMO, so they went there and they ran his lipids, and I want you to notice, everything here is normal. There is nothing abnormal. He had a carotid intimal medial thickness, it was normal, and they basically said, you're doing fine, there's nothing more we're going to do for you. Well, his daughter was very persistent, and she said, no, I'm not satisfied with that. So she took him to an out-of-network cardiologist who ran the pulse test, and I want to show you, look what happened in 12 months. He went from 3.6% up to 46. And that's over 8 times expected for him. So they sent him back to the HMO, and they ran a coronary artery calcium, which is a way of telling your total plaque burden, which was 600. It's not super high for a 77-year-old, but it's high. He couldn't do a stress test, and they took him right to angiography, and here's what they found. He was walking around with almost a total occlusion of the left anterior descending artery. That's just a trickle of blood going through there. That is the widowmaker. He was weeks away from having a heart attack or dying. As you can see on the right side, they stented him. He's doing very well now, and he looks 10 years younger. So that's a more extreme example. Now I'm going to show you, this is a younger person, 47, okay? This is from Eric Harrison, who's the cardiologist for all the Special Forces. This is a member of SEAL Team 6, and I showed this to you before, but I'm going to give you a little more detail on it now. So he was going to retire from the military, and he had a desk job for about 3 years. You'll notice that his BMI is a little high, but remember what we said. These Navy SEALs are very muscular, so the BMI is a little bit misleading. But I will tell you that he had a belly. He'd had a desk job for 3 years, and he kept eating the same way he did when he was in the field, and he gained weight. And he'd also been injured in multiple combat-related events, and he had a number of fractures in his chest that did not heal properly, so he had chronic chest pain. And they thought it was musculoskeletal, but the military likes to make sure that it's not service-related, so they decided to put him through the full course workup. And his family history was positive. Now you'll notice that we don't do gene sequencing. We used to do that. We use family history because we found that it was actually more powerful, and it's free. You just have to answer the question. It doesn't cost thousands of dollars. And his family history was positive, but everything else is pretty unremarkable. His EKG was normal. His echoes showed an athletic heart. His calculator from the American Heart Association and the ACC was normal. But his pulse score was 8.07%, which for a 47-year-old is way abnormal. It's over 5 times. So they elected to take him and do something called a CTA. Now you probably are familiar with angiograms where they put a catheter in you and inject dye. This is different. They give you a slight injection of dye, and then you do a high-resolution CTA to take a picture of your heart. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a minute, but I want to show you the color coding. Green is actually blood flowing through the artery. I know it's an odd color. Blue is the wall of the blood vessel, and yellow is going to be calcium, and red will be necrotic core. In these lesions, you do not want to see that red color. This is the hallmark of what we call the vulnerable patient. So let me show you what his actual CTA looks like. You'll notice this is his left anterior descending artery, and right there he has a 60% lesion. Now 60% is not normally stented, but if you look at it on cross-section, and this is special software that's not available everywhere, but you'll see he has 2 necrotic cores, those red spots. Those are the pimples that pop and cause a blood clot, okay? And because of this is Friday, Eric told him that he needed to be stented, even though it was only 60%, and put him on pre-op medications, which were pretty standard, and told him to come in Monday morning and they would do elective stents. Okay, and the reason I call this guy macho is because he felt like, since he had no symptoms, because he also passed a stress test, by the way. He achieved maximal output on a stress test with no EKG changes. And that's not unusual. But he went home and didn't take his medications, his pre-op medications, and about 48 hours later he's playing video games. He starts getting his usual chest pain. But his wife, who was a nurse and who was at the clinic, noticed that he was sweating. It's called diaphoresis. That's not normal. He was having pain and sweating. And against his wishes, she called the ambulance. And when they came, what you see here is he is in the middle of what's called a STEMI, an ST elevation heart attack. And the good news was he was only 10 minutes from the hospital. And you'll hear me repeatedly tell you that if you feel any symptoms, don't delay, don't try and work through it, because you have a 90-minute window to get to the hospital. That's all you have. Otherwise, you lose muscle in your heart and it doesn't come back. So what happened with him is they took him to the hospital, and I want to show you right here, both of those lesions ruptured like a pimple and caused a blood clot. And they stented him. You see it recovered nicely here. And then, I'm not sure it's going to work on your system here, but if you look, you see, this is an MRI 6 months later. There's a white streak right on the front right there. That is scarring of his myocardium. And the interesting thing is that it's less than half the thickness of the ventricle, which means that they preserve the function of his ventricle. In fact, his ejection fraction was 83% before the heart attack. It dropped below 40% during the heart attack. And at this point, it's 78%. And he is a very lucky person because he knew he was high risk and he got to the hospital in time. Now, I'm going to show you the 2 final cases here are not as dramatic as that, but they're really cool because they illustrate what lifestyle will do for you. So, this is a physician, 52. He'd been pre-diabetic for 10 years. His hemoglobin A1C was abnormal. His BMI is 26, he's just a little bit overpound, but all of his other parameters are normal. The American Heart Association calculator is normal, Framingham is normal. And when we ran the pulse test, so I'm going to show you here, you can see these are his lipids. They look pretty good. His hemoglobin A1C is pre-diabetic, and his small dense LDL, which is the smallest form of bad cholesterol, the most dangerous form, is just borderline. But his pulse test is 8.75%. It's right over, see right there? And that's over almost 5 times expected for his age. Now, at this point, my choice under AHA guidelines would be to put him on a statin. But lifestyle modification is also appropriate because he'd never had a heart attack before. So he asked for 4 months. And the reason this case is important because it illustrates the fact that you don't have to go to the gym to have a profound effect on your body. So we put him on a lifestyle prescription and gave him 4 months. Here's 4 months later. So he's 8.75% there. Look, he dropped to 2.24% in 4 months. And what we did for him was this. We just had him walk briskly, 30 minutes, 3 times a week. We had him do light resistance training on alternating days with a kettlebell and dumbbells. And the only dietary change we made for him was cutting out sugar and refined carbs. So fast forward 4 months, for the first time in 10 years, he's no longer pre-diabetic. He's lost 16 pounds. and his pulse is normal. So it shows that you can do this through lifestyle and diet. It's very possible. Now, the next case is my favorite case because you may know this person, okay? So look at that picture. It took me a while to find a picture. Okay, this is Mr. CEO. He's a very active 48-year-old, energetic, competitive guy. Basically, he has a positive family history, but everything else was pretty good. His BMI is good, and blood pressure was good. His calculations for the American College of Cardiology were okay. And you know, look, his lipids are okay, but no, I'm not showing you those, but I want to show you this because he's not highly abnormal. But look, the thing that bothered him is right here. His heart age is 59 and he's 48. Okay, now that irritated him, and you know, being a competitive guy, he said, "I'm going to do something about that." So when we did an audit of his lifestyle, a couple of things, you know, surfaced. Number one, you know how you can do too much of a certain type of exercise? Mm-hmm. Well, this individual was a case in point. Loved to run, probably ran a little too much and wasn't doing enough resistance training. And then there's this theory, if one glass of wine is good for you, maybe two is better. And a sweet tooth. So for this individual, we just basically said, okay, we're just going to do some minor things. We want you to cut back on the running and add resistance training and cut out the refined sugar and carbs. And look what happened. And this is in 2 months. In 2 months, he went to normal, and he dropped almost 8 years off of his heart age. That's only in 2 months. So Giuseppe, you know, you want to say something about this? Because he wasn't happy.
Nice. He looks better like that. He lost weight.
Yeah, that was me. You know, Mr. A-type personality, right? So you give me a test, I'm going to do my damnedest to improve. But it was really eye-opening. Here I am thinking that I'm doing all the right things to stay healthy. You know, I was a marathon runner, and we'll show you that slide coming up. But I was overrunning. I was doing 6 to 8 miles a day to try to stay in shape. You know, in our travel schedule, we travel all over the world, so maybe I wasn't watching my diet perfectly, and so I took the test. And this job has a little bit of stress, just a little bit. And so I took the test, and I see that my heart age is, I have the same risk of a heart attack as a person that's 59. That's how far the disease had progressed in my body. And that woke me up. And this is where I think that knowledge is power. And this is one of the things that I'm so grateful for, that we have scientists like Dr. Harrington, right, who, just like Dr. Nagasawa, put in years and years and years. I mean, he didn't tell you this, but his test was subject to a 31,000 patient study. 31,000. And as I told you guys yesterday, his test is the only test on the market that tells you the progression of the disease. And some people say they don't want to know. I want to know. I want to know. Because we put in too much work to suddenly drop dead, or to suddenly have a heart attack and survive, and then be disabled, right? And we're about empowerment. We're about knowledge. And once we know, now we have the choice. Now we have the choice. Are we going to do something about it? And then with the support of our teams, we can make changes. So I took it seriously. A couple months. It made a big difference. So thank you, Doug.
So, and Joe illustrates the case. This is just my final point. I hear a lot of doctors say, patients don't care. I tell them what to do and they don't do it. And they don't understand. But what we have found is, by giving people the right information, they make those choices themselves. They actually really want to do the right thing. And, I'm not the rah-rah guy up here, but I can tell you that all of you that are providing Max products to your colleagues and whatnot are actually participating in this. And so I think it's really a cool thing. And so bottom line is, you got to know where you are in your life, because every adult has some early heart disease. You need to take action, and you need to prevent. And so hopefully you got something out of this, and I think it's really cool that you're here. And so thank you. I'm done. 5 minutes early.